I never expected her to remember my name, let alone everything else. It was Thursday morning, the kind that smells like wet asphalt and burnt toast. I was folding laundry in the dim corner of the building's shared laundry room, socks paired in uneven stacks, when she appeared. My friend's mom, Mrs. Callahan, leaned against the doorway, holding a mug that steamed faintly in the chill. "Morning, Evan," she said, tilting her head slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips. She wasn't flashy, just precise in the small ways people notice when they've been watching you longer than you realize. I flicked my eyes toward her hands as she set the mug down on the counter, noticing the faint tremor when she adjusted her ring. Morning," I muttered, stuffing a sock into my bag. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. I cleared my throat, hoping the hum of the washer would swallow it. She nodded at the stack of clothes I'd folded. "You always fold them neatly," she said. Not like a compliment. Exactly. More like an observation you can't ignore. I shrugged. "It keeps me busy." There was a pause, and she sipped from her mug, the steam curling around her face. I tried not to stare, but the way she glanced at the detergent bottles, the soft crease near her eyes when she smiled, it was hypnotic in that ordinary, quiet way. I had come to the building that morning mostly because it was empty. My roommate was out of town, my phone full of unsent messages that I kept opening and closing. I liked this little corner of the world where no one expected anything from me. And then she showed up. "Did you hear from Alex?" she asked, a question so casual it could have been about the weather. I froze for a second, considering whether I should say anything. Not since yesterday," I admitted, fumbling with the sock. Her eyes softened, just a touch, and she tilted her head again. "He mentioned you might be stopping by later." I nodded, trying to hide the small flutter in my chest. I realized I was holding a pair of socks too tightly, and I let them drop into the basket with a soft thud. She laughed, soft, unassuming, not loud enough to make anyone else in the building notice, but just enough to make the air between us feel warmer. We worked in silence for a few minutes. I noticed the way her sleeve shifted as she leaned to grab a fabric softener bottle, and the small line of worry around her mouth, barely visible. I wanted to say something, anything, but my words stuck. Instead, I found myself adjusting the folds of a towel, pretending I was busy. "You always come here alone?" she asked suddenly. I hesitated. "Most of the time." I said it too quietly. She nodded, letting the conversation hang in the air, and I realized she understood more than she said. She glanced at the clock, sipped her coffee again, and then, without warning, placed the mug down and straightened. "I'm heading out. You take care of yourself, Evan." Her words weren't romantic, not in the way movies would make them, but when she turned to leave, there was a tilt of her shoulder, a soft exhale, that made the air feel thicker than before. I wanted to follow her, or say something clever, or even just make her laugh, but my voice betrayed me again. As she reached the door, her hand lingered on the frame for a moment, and then she was gone. I stared at the door long after it closed, imagining the warmth of the mug in her hands, the faint scent of coffee, and something else I couldn't name. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from an unknown number. I pulled it out. "Evan, can you meet me tonight? I have something to show you." I didn't reply immediately. I didn't even breathe. I just stared at the screen, my fingers trembling slightly over the keys, wondering what she was hiding. I met her that evening in the small cafe around the corner. The kind where the light hits the wooden tables just so, and the hum of the espresso machine feels like part of the conversation. She was already seated, a scarf loosely draped over her shoulders, eyes on a notebook. When she looked up, that faint smile again, and I felt my chest tighten. "Thanks for coming," she said, pushing a cup of tea toward me. The steam rose slowly, curling between us like a fragile barrier. "Yeah," I murmured, tugging at the sleeve of my hoodie. I wasn't sure I'd get the time right. She tilted her head, studying me in that way she did, softly, like she could read the invisible lines I kept drawn around myself. "I wanted to show you something," she said, flipping the notebook closed. "It's old letters from before I moved here. I thought you might like to see them." I nodded, and for a few minutes we looked at the letters together, passing them back and forth, our fingers brushing lightly. One of her hands lingered over the page as if she couldn't let go entirely. "They're from when I was your age," she said quietly, tracing a faded sentence with her finger. "I was different then. Less careful, more restless. Funny how life feels bigger when you're 20. I swallowed hard, thinking about how her voice carried both nostalgia and regret. "I sometimes feel that way too," I admitted, glancing down at my tea. "Like I'm half expecting life to surprise me or slip away." She nodded, her eyes soft. "You notice things most people don't, even small ones." Her gaze flicked to my hands, folded tightly around the cup, then back to mine. "I like that about you." Something in me wanted to protest, to remind her of the obvious boundaries. But I stayed quiet, watching the way the lamplight caught the strands of her hair, how she tucked one behind her ear without thinking. I imagined all the ways this connection was forbidden, her being my friend's mother, twice divorced, carrying her own quiet wounds. And yet, sitting across from her, sharing tea, I felt a sense of ease I hadn't felt in years. She shifted slightly, leaning to stir her tea. I noticed the faint tremor in her hand again, the way she tucked her fingers under the cup. I imagined holding her hand to steady it, but only let my thumb brush the edge of the saucer instead. We sat in silence after that, letting the weight of words and letters settle. There was a strange intimacy in simply being near each other, in watching her readjust the scarf, in the shared warmth of the tea. Finally, she looked up, eyes catching mine in a soft, deliberate gaze. "You're quiet tonight," she said, and there was a teasing lift at the corner of her mouth. I smiled a little shakily. "Maybe I'm learning from the best," I said. Her fingers brushed mine briefly as she handed me a letter, light and fleeting, and yet it lingered longer than any words we'd spoken. That small gesture, almost accidental, seemed to say everything we weren't allowed to say. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. The next evening, I found myself lingering outside her apartment door longer than I should have. My hand hovered over the key, then retreated. I told myself I wasn't nervous, just careful. She opened the door before I could knock. "Hey," she said, her voice lighter than I expected. But there was a pause, a hesitation I hadn't noticed before. Her scarf was gone, her hair loose over one shoulder, casual yet deliberate. I stepped inside. The apartment smelled faintly of jasmine and old books. I noticed a small stack of unopened letters on the counter. She glanced at them, then at me, her eyes briefly flicking down, then back. "Do you want some tea?" she asked, but her hand wavered, and the teapot sat half on the burner. I nodded, careful not to move too quickly. "Sure." We sat across from each other, the table between us like a fragile barrier. I wanted to reach for her hand, to brush a stray hair from her face, but I didn't. Instead, I stirred my tea, the spoon clinking against the cup. She did the same, and our eyes met over the rim of the mugs, lingering just a second too long. I thought maybe you'd want to see the rest of the letters," she said, her voice trailing. She picked one up, then paused, thumb hovering over the worn paper. "Or maybe not. I don't know what you expect from this." I opened my mouth, then closed it. I didn't know either. I just wanted to stay in the quiet, close enough that her presence filled the space I usually reserved for silence. A sudden knock at the door made us both jump. I looked at her, half panic, half amusement in her eyes. She muttered, "Alex." My friend's voice called from the hallway. "Mom, are you here?" She cursed softly under her breath, eyes flicking to mine. "Go, stay, wait," she muttered, and I froze, unsure if she meant me or herself. Alex's footsteps receded, leaving a quiet tension in the room. I could feel it in the weight of the air, the pause in her breathing, the slight tightening of her shoulders. I wanted to speak, to fill it with something, but words felt like clumsy intrusions. We sat in silence again. She reached across the table, almost brushing my hand as she picked up a letter. Her fingers lingered just above mine. I felt my pulse jump. She looked at me, eyes searching, or maybe apologetic. I wanted to lean in, to see if the air between us could carry more, but I stopped myself, letting the moment hang. I caught the faint tremor in her lips as she exhaled softly. I imagined her leaning closer, the the world shrinking to just us. My chest ached with the half-thought, the almost touch, the half-confession that hovered on the edge of air and silence. Instead, she set the letter down and looked away, folding her hands loosely in her lap. "It's late," she said softly. "You should go." I stood, throat tight. "Yeah." And as I stepped toward the door, my hand brushed hers for a fraction of a second, long enough to burn a memory into my skin, short enough that it could mean nothing. I didn't know if I'd crossed a line or if the line had moved on its own. It was late afternoon when I ran into her on the street, the sky overcast, wet leaves sticking to the soles of my sneakers. She was carrying a small paper bag from the bakery, the scent of bread faintly clinging to her coat. "Evan," she said, a little breathless, adjusting the bag in her hands. She smiled, but there was something taut about her shoulders, something I hadn't noticed before. "Hey," I said, fumbling with my hoodie zipper. I wanted to step closer, but my feet felt heavy. We walked side by side, the quiet rhythm of our steps louder than the distant traffic. I noticed the way she glanced at the bakery bag, then at me, like weighing something she couldn't say. I saw Alex earlier," she said finally, voice low. "He asked about you." I didn't tell him, her words faltered. She took a breath, shaking her head slightly. "I don't know why I didn't." I swallowed. My chest tightened. Jealousy, guilt, longing, all tangled inside me. I wanted to tell her it was fine, that I didn't mind, but my voice caught in my throat. "I keep thinking," she said, stopping suddenly to shift the bag, "that maybe I shouldn't, that this, whatever this is, maybe it's wrong." I looked down, watching her fingers clutch the paper bag. My own hands itched to reach for her, to steady her, or maybe to cross some invisible line we hadn't named yet. But I stayed silent. She looked up then, eyes raw and searching. "Do you ever think about it? About us?" Her voice dropped almost to a whisper, the pause stretching longer than anything I could fill. I wanted to lie. I wanted to say no. But the truth pressed at my chest, heavy and immediate. I imagined every glance, every brush of her hand, every quiet moment we'd shared, how it had left a mark I couldn't erase. "Yes," I said finally, barely audible. My voice trembled. "I think about it more than I probably should." She blinked, a shiver running through her shoulders. For a moment, the world narrowed to just us. The wet sidewalk, the scattered leaves, the faint smell of bread, and that soft, impossible question hanging between us. I don't know if I can stop thinking," she admitted. Her voice was flat, but her hands shook as she held the bag closer. "And I shouldn't," her words broke off. A bus rolled past, splashing water onto the curb, and we both flinched. She laughed softly, almost embarrassed. I could feel the tension in her jaw, the way her eyes darted away, then back at me. I wanted to lean in, to close the gap, to touch her face or whisper something I couldn't say. My stomach twisted with the weight of it, and yet I froze, letting the moment linger. She shifted the bag in her hands, glanced down at the damp pavement, then back at me. And in that brief, aching pause, I realized we were standing on the edge of something that could change everything. Her voice, quiet and uncertain, broke the silence. "Do you want this as much as I do?" And just like that, the question hung between us, unanswered, trembling, like a line drawn in the air we both dared not cross. The next week was quiet. Too quiet. I stopped seeing her at the cafe, stopped timing my walks past her apartment. The letters went unopened. The tea sat cold in my cupboard. I told myself it was coincidence the first day. Maybe she was busy, distracted. But by the third day, my phone buzzed with a message I didn't recognize. It was from her, but the words weren't what I expected. "Sorry. Can't meet this week." I stared at it too long, my thumb hovering over the reply button, then setting the phone down again. The words didn't sting, they unsettled me. I felt paused, like life had forgotten to finish the sentence. When I did see her, it was fleeting. On the street corner near the bakery, she passed without looking up, scarf tied around her neck, eyes fixed ahead. I wanted to call her name, to wave, but my feet stayed planted. And then I noticed it. A small photograph, pinned to the corkboard in her apartment window. Her with a boy who couldn't be more than 7, smiling like the sun hit just right. The photo was old, a snapshot from a weekend I hadn't known existed. My chest tightened. She hadn't mentioned him, not once. I imagined all the mornings she'd spent juggling schedules, small hands tugging at her coat, letters left unanswered. I felt a strange mix of jealousy, curiosity, and guilt. Mine, or maybe hers. I tried reaching out several times. Drafted messages I never sent, rehearsed words I never spoke. Each time I paused before hitting send, imagining her reading them and realizing the wrongness of it all. And then, just as suddenly, my routine shifted. I'd walk past her apartment, expecting to see her light on in the window, the little stack of letters waiting for me. But the window was dark, the chair empty. Even the faint smell of bread seemed absent. I couldn't tell if she had moved on, or if she was simply protecting some part of herself I wasn't allowed to touch. I sat one evening on the bench outside the building, hands wrapped around a cold coffee cup, staring at the darkened windows. My mind replayed the last time we had walked together, the way her eyes lingered on mine, the weight of her questions still pressing in the quiet. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. The phone buzzed again, this time a wrong number. I didn't pick it up. I didn't want to interrupt the silence, even if it meant missing something important. I imagined her somewhere, holding her son's hand, glancing at the world with that same soft, careful gaze she'd cast on me. And I realized that maybe some connections weren't meant to be completed neatly. They just hovered, like letters waiting to be read, their meaning suspended. I left the bench, cold fingers tracing the rim of the cup, and walked home. The chair by the window remained empty, the page of the story unwritten, and I didn't knock. I found her on a rainy evening, standing on the narrow balcony of her apartment. The sky was a dull gray, and water dripped slowly from the eaves. I hesitated at the door, watching her wrap her arms around herself, coat hanging loose, hair damp. "Evan," she said, almost a whisper. Not a greeting, not an invitation, just a name. I stepped closer. "Hey," my voice uneven. I didn't move onto the balcony. There was no need to. The space between us felt full enough. She looked at me, really looked, and for a moment the world shrank. I could see the tension in her jaw, the quiet weight she carried every day, the lines around her eyes that softened when she wasn't pretending. I wasn't sure if you'd come," she said, fumbling with the railing. Her fingers traced a ring absent-mindedly, and I noticed the faint tremor. "I thought I should," I said, pausing. Even if I don't really know why." Her shoulders dropped slightly, like a small weight lifted, but her eyes remained wary. "I keep thinking about what we almost did," she admitted. "And She stopped, swallowing. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, but I stayed where I was, letting the rain wash over the pause between us. "I think about it too," I said softly. "Maybe more than I should." She let out a breath, long and slow, and it felt like the first real exhale in days. "I'm scared," she said, voice breaking just a fraction. "I don't want to lose anything. And yet, I don't want to hide this." I nodded. Words failed me, as they always did in front of her. Instead, I leaned just slightly closer, careful, tentative. Our hands brushed, fingers touching, not grasping. A small, electric weight settled there. "I don't know what this is," I said, "or what we're supposed to do. But I'm here. I'm not leaving." Her eyes softened, and for a long moment, she just let that be enough. No confessions about the future, no declarations. Just presence, just acknowledgement. She smiled faintly, almost shyly, a small curve of lips that spoke volumes in its restraint. I smiled back, a little awkwardly, a little relieved. "Okay," she said, voice quiet but steady. That single word carried more than it seemed. A permission, a truce, a recognition. We stood there, rain dripping around us, hands still barely touching, sharing something intimate without naming it. The world continued outside the balcony, indifferent and wet, and yet, for a few minutes, the space between us didn't need filling. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and somehow that was enough. It had been months since the rain-soaked balcony, since the letters, and the almost confessions and the pauses that stretched too long. Life had shifted, quietly, without fanfare. I still woke at 8:47 a.m., still brewed black coffee that cooled too fast, still folded socks in uneven stacks. But now, sometimes, she was there, leaning against the counter, watching me with a soft, patient gaze. She moved through her days with the same care she always had, tending to her little routines, but somehow, the edges of them felt lighter. I found myself making excuses to linger, helping with laundry, carrying groceries up the stairs, passing a note slipped under her door when the wind tossed it half onto the hallway carpet. Our connection had grown, not in dramatic leaps, but in tiny, accumulated moments. Shared tea in the corner cafe, her hand brushing mine while reaching for a letter, the quiet Sunday mornings on the bench near the park. She had shown me patience. I had learned to listen. One evening, I found her waiting at that same bench where we had first sat awkwardly, letting silence speak between us. She carried a thermos, the familiar smell of warm coffee curling up as she set it on the seat. I joined her, shoulder brushing hers, and we drank quietly, watching the city breathe around us. "You remembered," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I remembered," I said, shrugging, though my chest lifted a little. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't a declaration. It was acknowledgement. Time continued. Letters arrived and went unanswered. Alex grew a little taller, and errands were still errands. But now, somehow, our worlds overlapped without friction. The awkward pauses had softened. Silences felt comfortable rather than heavy. We didn't speak about the moments that had almost unraveled us, or the days when uncertainty had ruled. There was no need. We understood each other in the small gestures. The way she poured my coffee just slightly hotter than her own. The way I left my hoodie draped over the back of her chair. The brush of our hands as we passed a package along the hallway. On a quiet morning, she leaned back against the bench and let the steam of her coffee fog her glasses. I watched her, and for a moment, the world was reduced to that small curve of her lips, the tilt of her head, the way her hair caught the light. "I like this," she said softly. "Just this." "Me too," I said. And that was it. No confessions, no promises. Just presence. Just earned peace. Just knowing we were here, together, in ways that mattered more than words could ever capture. As I folded my hands around the cup, I realized that every paused message, every hesitant glance, every almost touch had led us here. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like something that could quietly last. I didn't think about tomorrow. Not in a grand way. I just let the warmth sit between us, and I understood, without needing to say, that some connections don't need fireworks to be alive. Only we would know. Only we would remember.